So scientists, this is really when plant pathology gets born, and when scientists around the world start to look for ways of killing the fungi very seriously. And they dug something else up out of the ground. That's copper sulfate. Again, very simple chemical structure that can be used to kill fungi. What they found was the best way to use copper sulfate was to boil it with lime. And so in villages throughout France and England, they had these town squares where they would have these vats where they would cook copper sulfate with lime and boil the heck out of it, and there would be a mixture called the Bordeaux mixture, named after that province in France. So they began to work with this as a way of controlling and killing the fungi. And it worked pretty good. In France, they did experiments, and this is really the beginnings of plant pathology as we know it, where they did experiments side by side. And they said, gee, if we don't spray with Bordeaux mixture, we get 1 potato, and where we do spray, we get 5 potatoes, 400% increase in potato yields. And the United States begins to get in the act at this time, too, where, with the birth of experiment stations at universities, 20 years of tests at the University of Vermont, where they looked at Bordeaux, all the things that we take for granted now. When do you spray it? What rate do you spray it? What formulation do you use? They worked on this for 20 years, and what they saw over 20 years in Vermont was a 64% increase in potatoes as a result of spraying the fungicide. And so pictures like this were very common in the early 1900s. And one of the things I emphasize to audiences is, you know, we've been spraying the potato crop in the United States for about 100 years with fungicides to kill the late blight fungus. It's not something that started last year or 10 years ago. We've really never had a commercial crop for the last 100 years without spraying like this. And so historically, spraying with Bordeaux mixture was very common in Europe and the United States. And then World War I comes along. You know, the French and Germans shooting at one another for 4 years in these trenches. And one of the impacts that this had for plant pathology was that all the copper in Germany was used for the war effort. They needed it for shell casings. They needed it for electric wire. And so the Germans had no potato fungicide available in 1915 and 16. All the copper was going to the front. And again, potatoes were really important in the diets of the German people. So what happened? Well, in 1916, an uncontrollable late blight epidemic in potato fields in Germany. 700,000 German civilians starved to death. They were counting on a bountiful potato crop to get them through the winter, and their potatoes rotted instead because they didn't have a fungicide. This is what happens when, you know, it's a worst case scenario. There's no fungicide, you lose the crop, 700,000 people die. And it was also a very important morale weakening factor for the German army. You know, you're in the trenches and you're getting a letter from back home that your mom and your sisters have died because you know, they don't have potatoes because the copper's in your shell casings. Well, let's talk about, you know, bringing you up to date on the late blight fungus. And I'm sure a lot of people in this room are aware of what's been going on in the last 10 years or so here in the United States. There are 2 mating types for the fungus. There's the A1 type, those lemon-shaped spores, and they just clone themselves. It's asexual reproduction, and so it's fairly simple fungus. But there are really 2 mating types, the A1 and the A2s. And when you get those 2 mating types together, you get a really tough new kind of spore. You get a spore with a very thick protective cell wall. You can see the A1s and A2s getting together, and you can see that really tough spore. And so we were fortunate in the United States for many, many years. Up prior to 1992, there were no A1 and A2 mating types in the United States. All the mating types we had in the United States were A1s. So wouldn't you know that strange things would happen in New York first? That's where they first began to see in 93 and 94 the matings of A1s and A2s. And so there were potato losses. I mean, there were a lot of potato growers that were coming to EPA and asking for Section 18s, new ways of dealing with this problem. 95, 96, the A1s and A2s spread throughout the country, 96, 97, and at this point, they've displaced all the A1s. All we've got in the United States are A1s and A2s. We don't have any A1s anymore. So we still have our potato crop. We still have a bountiful potato crop, and this problem is under control. And it's under control because growers in the United States have significantly increased their use of fungicides. So if you look at, this is data from USDA. If you look at fungicide use rates in the early 90s when they just had A1s, 2 pounds an acre in Oregon and North Dakota and Washington, and now they're spraying 10 and 12 pounds an acre. So it's a problem that's under control, but it's under control because fungicide use has really gone up in potato production in the last dozen years to take care of this new problem.